when we talked earlier, you stated that AI product manager is not a long-term role. Can you unpack why you believe that and how you see the evolution of PM roles in AI-driven organizations?
I think longer term, it really doesn't matter. There's a high amount of uncertainty for AI stuff in general right now. But once we get through 2 or 3 generations of this, kind of like how in mobile, at first it was a bunch of like toy apps. But now you look at something like TikTok, that is a really dialed in experience. We're building technologies that we can't fully specify or even understand sometimes because of the non-deterministic nature of them, how they'll act in every single situation. The biggest issue right now is actually and there's a lot of competitors that are starting to enter the marketplace.
You talked about hacking satellites. I know that you were a great hacker. Can you elaborate on that? Welcome to the Product Founder Podcast, Chris. Today we have Chris, Staff Product Operation Manager at GitHub. I'm very excited to talk about a lot of interesting things. Chris, can you let us know a little bit about your background and how did you end up in the product management world?
Sure. So thank you for having me. Yeah, I guess I'm Chris Butler, and I would say that I most identify as a product manager, but I played a lot of other roles as well. But I guess like when I was growing up, I was actually an apprentice to my dad, who was a graphic designer. And so originally I was supposed to be some type of industrial designer for automotive design. That was his dream for me, or either that or become an inventor. And so this was kind of the time when we were making the transition from, spray adhesive, X-Acto knives, like cutting up actual like layouts and putting them on board. And then helping him go over to, digital things like Quark Express and Illustrator and stuff like that. And so I guess I got a lot of experience in just like working with someone that was, well regarded in the graphic design industry. He won a couple awards, which were called pencils, basically. And so he was like really great at what he did. He couldn't really draw. That was maybe the funniest thing, is that he was actually a pretty bad artist, but he was really good at sketching and coming up with concepts and ideas and that idea. And so I learned a lot from him about that. But when I was in high school, I guess I always was drawn towards this new technology, which included online services like bulletin boards. I actually ran like a Where's board, which was a place where pirated software would be traded. I used to build a lot of things called red boxes and other types of like freaker stuff, which is all about like phone systems. And so I don't know, I just was always really interested and excited by technology. I think the thing I really wanted to do was actually hack a satellite, but I never was able to do that. So that's maybe one thing that I didn't get to do of that dream. But so because of that, I guess when I went to go and like look at art schools, I would include, like a zip disk full of content, which was like a hard drive essentially. And they would ask like where are all my sketches, where are all of my sculptures that I did to get into this art school. But I was a commercial artist. And so for me, it was always like, it was very weird to have to be technologically forward in things, but also doing stuff that had not fully transformed yet. And so anyways, I then went into engineering school and did computer systems engineering. And then from that, I ended up interviewing at a bunch of places and was asked by Microsoft to join a program manager interview rather than an engineering interview.
Let's pause here for a second. The other day, I was looking into our channel analytics and I noticed many of you guys are watching a lot of our episodes, but not yet subscribed to our YouTube page or Spotify. I will ask you as a favor, please support us by subscribing to our YouTube page and Spotify page. And I will promise you, I will do everything in my power to make each episode better and better. Thank you.
And so I got these like job offers from like General Dynamics and Motorola for like secure technology type of roles. But the one with Microsoft was most interesting because they would ask me questions like, one of the interview questions was, how would you design a washer dryer combination for someone that was sight impaired? And so asking that type of question, trying to put yourself in someone else's point of view, trying to understand how they might use something, what are the necessary things that need to get done, even with these types of trade-offs, like was very just kind of intuitively exciting to me. And so that's when I went into program management, which at Microsoft at the time, and this is like in 2000, was kind of a in-between of project and product management is what I would say. And then since then, I always have to have like weird side projects. And so, worked in very large technology companies like Microsoft, Facebook, Cognizant, Google, and now I'm at GitHub. But I've also worked at like smaller companies like Waze and Kayak. And I even started my own company. I've worked at a venture capital firm that was based out of Hong Kong, where I was like kind of incubating products or helping our portfolio companies, which included, even DeepMind was one of our portfolio companies. And then I also worked at consultancies where I would work with, teams that were trying to figure out something new or get facilitation to think differently than the way they did. And so, anyways, and now I do a bunch of weird side projects around I've been really interested and excited by design fiction recently, which is kind of a speculative practice. So I'll just say I have a very weird, I guess it's very tech oriented career, but it also is varied in the types of roles that I've had. I've done business development, I've done tech evangelism, those are all things that I've done. But I think I would identify as a mindset as a product manager first. And then even when I was doing business development, I still approached it as kind of product management. It was just more partnership focused. Or when right now, I do product operations for the last couple of roles, and I really think of that as PMing the PM experience. And so for me, it's still about product management. It's about how am I understanding my customer and kind of solving their problems. But it's in these different focuses. In this case, for me, product operations is really about team dynamics and the way that we help people be able to be as effective as possible in a very innovative kind of role. And so that's kind of how I think about it. And so we're here today, and I live in Oakland, California, but I've lived in other places like Hong Kong and New York. And so, yeah, anyways, I guess that's kind of a good summary to start.
Yeah, absolutely. No, you have a very fascinating experience working at so many interesting companies and also very interesting projects that you talk about. One more I want to ask you. So you talked about hacking satellites. I know that you were a great great hacker.
Yeah, gray hat. Yeah, that's what I would call it back then.
Yeah, can you a little bit elaborate on that?
Yeah, so the terminology around white hat or black hat usually is black hat are usually just criminals. They're doing things that are to make money. Usually they're hacking systems to be able to exploit them to make money. White hat hackers tend to be people that are those that are trying to help protect the systems, and so they might do some hacking to show that there's a problem, but then they'll do kind of good disclosures. They'll make sure the company knows about it. And this comes from the Old West kind of TV shows that would happen in the 20th century, where you could really tell the good guys, the bad guys, quote unquote, from each other based on the color of hat that they had, essentially. When I say gray hat, what I mean by that is that there were definitely things that I would make or do that were to be able to exploit a system, but not necessarily for someone's gain, someone's benefit, other than my own or the group of people that I was working with. And so, but to me, it was a lot of, kind of interest in trying to understand why systems work the way they do. And a lot of the assumptions that go into a system then also turns into exploits of that system. And I think that, we can take that all the way into human dynamics as well. And that's why most actual hacking or things like that end up being a lot about kind of social engineering, which is that you're not necessarily worried about the technological system is important because there are going to be exploits there, but usually it's in human behavior that you're looking at. And so that's why Kevin Mitnick, who's a very famous hacker, he was barely able to use a computer. That wasn't what he was good at. He was really good at doing social engineering. And so anyways, I'm definitely not in the security realm as much anymore, but I guess I bring that kind of adversarial mindset. And I've done talks about how I think about adversarial product management, or just in general, sparring partners inside of an organization are really valuable. And I think that's where actually between the different teams that we end up working with as product managers, we should be finding healthy tensions, because that helps us build a better product. And so, product should be pushing for things that are customer centric. Engineering should be making sure we build things that are maintainable. And those things are not at all in alignment all the time. And so using and kind of helping build that tension in a healthy way, right, which allows for conversation, I think ends up doing things. So that's kind of maybe that's a long kind of discussion about what we were talking about as far as gray hat hacking. But, I build red boxes, which would allow you to pretend that you were putting quarters or dimes into a payphone. Or I ran these wares boards, which were places to exchange pirated software, things like that. And I actually met some of my really close friends through a local chapter of the 2600 meeting, which is a famous kind of hacker magazine and zine that's been around for a really long time. But if I wouldn't call myself necessarily a computer hacker, I was more of what we would refer to as a phone freaker with a PH, because I dealt more with kind of communication systems than other things. But I've definitely built my share of hypercard stacks that would generate credit card numbers or help you do cell phone cloning and stuff like that. So anyways, I guess I'm just always interested in again, the exploitation of technologies are interesting because it helps you understand the assumptions that go into it. And I would say that a lot of the work I do now with AI, especially generative systems, we have to do an awful lot of what's commonly referred to now as red teaming. Red teaming to me means something very specific. It usually means penetration testing from a computer security standpoint. But when we talk about how do we make sure that this AI system is not going to create kind of unfair, biased type of results, we have to do a lot of what I'll call harm evaluation. But a lot of people kind of colloquially call it red teaming, which again is just like a misuse of a term, I think. But that's what I would say is like these things are super important when we're building technologies that we can't fully specify or even understand sometimes because of the non-deterministic nature of them, how they'll act in every single situation, right? And that's really interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. Very interesting backstory as well. And so now, how your diverse experience shaped your perspective on AI and product ops?
Yeah, I guess just seeing lots of different contexts that people try to work together, right? So I've worked at very large companies. I've worked at very small companies where it was just me and a co-founder. I've worked on different projects that were, I would say, more collaboratives than they were kind of regular management structures. And I guess what really, matters in those cases is that we try to understand the way that people are working together, right? So the socio side of the socio-technical system. And then we understand that the things that where we're working between people, they're actually intermediated in some ways through technology. And so I think what we end up doing as product people sometimes is we create a frame by which we want to actually understand that system. And then we usually just look inside that frame. I think what I usually try to do is try to constantly understand not just this frame, but wider frames, more narrow frames that are kind of off-center to what we might usually understand. And so this is taking me to interesting places. Like when I was working at Facebook Reality Labs, I was working on the Portal device. And this was basically a video calling device and home assistant that you could put on like your kitchen counter. And the real kind of benefit there was being able to call people that you cared about and being able to connect with them, especially during a time right when the pandemic was happening. What we started to find, and what as one of the things I was working on there was really about identity, like who is in front of this device and what access should they have. And what was interesting about that was the person who sets up the device is not always the person that's using it most of the time. And that becomes really weird. And the reason why it becomes weird is so I have like 4 kids, and most of them know how to use kind of home devices now from a voice interface standpoint. And so they'll just play music that they want to listen to. The problem is that for a while, I had my personal Spotify account attached to that device. And so when I would look at my like Spotify like year-end review or recommendations, it would be very weird because it would have like Minecraft music is the current thing that shows up there a lot, or like, video game rap battles, which one of my sons listens to right now. And I don't really enjoy that music, but it's skewing a lot of the way that I end up using that service. And so I think that's where I really start to think about this, is that understanding that we're talking about actually people interacting with other people with these technologies in between them, I think is a different viewpoint than just saying that this is a person and a technology interacting with each other. And there's a really interesting kind of academic theory called actor network theory, which talks a lot about if we start to consider kind of actants inside the system are not just people, but technologies. And then this idea of the network in the way that like transformation or translation of things happen between these people, we start to understand much better what are the needs that we have here. And not to be too academic, I mean, another kind of interesting theory about like privacy is called contextual integrity, which really thinks an awful lot about the information that's being sent, who's receiving it, who's sending it, but also the norms that are then at play within that relationship. And so an example would be that it makes perfect sense for me to share my medical history with my doctor, but for my doctor to share medical history with me is weird, right? And so once we start to get into like the technological realm, things like Google Street View are an amazing example of where if I'm just walking around a neighborhood and I see the front of a house, that makes sense because I'm there physically, I'm walking around. But if suddenly anybody from anywhere in the world can see the front of my house, that starts to feel weird in some way. That's because there's a different norm set that are at play inside of here. And so anyways, that's what I would say. I tend to think about these problems in a way that, it's not necessarily unique. I would say there's lots of other system thinkers that are out there within product. But I think looking at it with that framing, with trying to understand that it's really just about people in a network, I think gives you a slightly different viewpoint than the idea of like human in the loop when we talk about like AI stuff is really focused on just that person and that technology, not all of the other people that might be impacted by that technology. So I think that's like an important viewpoint to bring to this type of work.
And what
the actual devices still work. I actually have one on my TV that I still use to call my mom and my sister all the time for the kids. But it is now unfortunately RIP, and they're still keeping up the service because it still integrates with like the Facebook network and WhatsApp networks. But I was really sad to see that because I think like, Facebook has an amazing network of people There's not really any other company at that scale that has that type of network. Like I would say that Google doesn't, Microsoft doesn't, maybe Apple does with FaceTime, but they have not taken advantage of that yet for the biggest screen in your home, which is usually your TV. And so anyways, I think there's still huge opportunity for this type of device. I just think that my personal opinion was that the Portal device ended up trying to do too many things. It was trying to compete with every other set-top box that was there. And that meant there was a lot of different work that was happening to like get every app onto it or everything like that, rather than really hyper-focusing on the fact that this was about calling and about connecting people. And so, yeah, anyways, it's too bad, but they are no longer, I guess the team is no longer there. Again, they may still be working on like internal uses of this. Like I think there was like a very interesting use case for video conferencing for like business use cases still. But again, I don't know what's going on inside, but it's too bad.
How much was the cost of this product?
So I think you could get the set-top box for something like $99 or $199. And then the bigger devices that would be standalone things with like screens would be up to $500. I think there was one that had a really big screen where you could actually rotate the screen around, whether you wanted to have like the different kind of view. And so it was like in that range. And if you look at a lot of the devices today, like the Google Home Hub, any of like the Macs, the ones like the Alexa Macs or something like that, like they all start to integrate screens at a certain point because you want more context when trying to interact with it. But it is still something that you can use without looking at a screen. And so there's some interesting kind of like affordances that come out because of it. But I think what's really, really exciting and interesting is that we still are not doing enough to allow for multiple people to interact with the same device at the same time. Really what ends up happening is that you still end up kind of, and this was like a very interesting issue we tried to deal with inside of like Facebook Reality Labs, was what happens when two people are talking at the device at the same time. We could start to build things that are very complex about like discerning different voices, taking both of those things, doing turn taking, like a bunch of stuff like that. But in the end, we actually used a very interesting kind of role play prototyping that kind of methodology that I use, which is basically having some people pretend to be humans and other people to be the devices in this case. And we role played a bunch of different ways that people might interrupt with each other and how the device might act in that case. And someone was pretending to do that. And we just realized that it was like very awkward for the device to make any assumptions about what was happening inside of that home. And so we ended up just using like last utterance essentially as what guides us. And that still is the way most of these devices work. But I think it's like a very interesting kind of issue is how do you allow for multiple people to interact with these devices? Another interesting case of this is like set-top boxes, like Apple TV, for example. Recommendation services there are very hard to do well. And the reason why is because it's usually like once you live in a multi-person home, it's not just about what you want to watch, but it's about what are you all willing to watch right now. And I wrote like a short piece for the O'Reilly blog about this because there's a small domain of research around kind of multi-person recommendation services. And it gets very weird because it's not just about like, what is the thing that everybody would agree to? It's actually sometimes, again, that turn-taking kind of approach where right now it's this kid's turn to watch something, and then next time it's that kid's turn to watch something. And so showing kind of the stuff, and what I found, like just from behavioral standpoint, because kids like to watch the same thing over and over again, we end up actually not looking at recommendations at all. We just look at like, how will we continue to watch a series that is then that kid's turn to watch? And so you end up like, anyways, these are just kind of like weird kind of externalities that I think when people just think about this, they're like, oh, we're just going to use all the behavioral data and just give them a good recommendation list based on the behavior. But how do you know that all that behavior is one person? And if there's a different person sitting in front of that device, that recommendation service then is totally odd. It's like opening someone else's Netflix profile and you're like, what is this person watching? Like, I don't understand. I mean, and again, it's not like fair because like you probably have your weird stuff that you watch, right? But it's one of those things that is very interesting to me. And I maybe taking it to another weird place is I think with like all these like generative kind of experiential possibilities now, everybody can build an app eventually that is their own app that will interface with some type of data specifically for them. And I think we're going to get into this weird place. Like, does that mean that there needs to be an explosion of everybody has their own personal version of an app? And then how do we make it so that that person can also work with other people? Because it's kind of like today, if you build a spreadsheet and you send it to someone else, there's always something about that spreadsheet that like bothers you because you're like, this is not my exact mental model about this data, right? And so I just think there's something really weird about this that we have to figure out.
You know what I really enjoy about this podcast is every week I have a chance to really go deep into the mind of a great product manager. And now when you start talking about all of these, I actually started saying like, yeah, about the, for example, the one about like the video call you talk, I was like, that's an interesting challenge. And then now you shift to AI system recognizing who is talking to them at that particular time. I was like, that's also an interesting. And then now we shifted to this third one. I was like, wow, there's a lot of things that I'm very happy that I just talk about.
Well, that's what product management is really hard because of the fact that like, I guess my mindset is always that I do not know everything. And so I'd say my motto is I am wrong today. I just don't know how yet. And so that means that I end up exploring lots of these types of issues. I would say that there's other types of product managers that are also very successful that are very certainty mindset. And they're like, I know based on my experience, this is the best way to do things. So I'm just going to execute it that way. And I think what we need to have is we need to have these different types of personalities inside a product because, I feel like we're not building the best device that we could in that type of case because we're not understanding these types of issues. Now, trying to convince people of this was really hard internally, right? I would say that anytime I've worked at a place where there's like very, very smart people, they just seem to think that there's just like, this is the one way to do it. And we can't explore anything else because we just know for sure this is the right way. I just don't feel that is true. And both of these mindsets are important because those other mindsets will just get things done probably at a good quality, right? But it won't always like understand the externalities in a way that I think my mindset will bring. And so there's a trade-off here that we need to make. And sometimes you need to be in that type of mode and other times you need to be in this mode. Because when it came to one of the things that we end up releasing in beta for the portal was this idea of like a household identity. And the reason why that was really important is that from a privacy and security standpoint, you do not want everybody in your household to have access to every one of your friends in Facebook, right? Especially because like you just collect friends. It might be like an ex-partner or something like that. In the case of like people at Facebook, a lot of people were friends with Mark Zuckerberg on Facebook because that's how they did a lot of their networking at first. And so anyways, it just gets like, I think there's like a really important aspect that we need to acknowledge that there's no such thing as one type of great product manager. There's lots of different types of great product managers, and we need all of them to be able to really build exceptional things.
Yeah, I think this is a great point to kind of navigate to the next question. So when we talked earlier, you stated that AI product manager is not a long-term role. Can you unpack why you believe that that and how you see the evolution of PM roles in AI-driven organizations?
Yeah, I mean, I like to go back to a story when I was just joining Kayak. And so I was in this weird kind of product manager, business development hybrid role. And it was really because this was before mobile traffic to Kayak, like through their mobile web and app, was going to surpass desktop web traffic. And what was very interesting and maybe exciting about this is like, what does that mean for the way that for like the behavior of the customer and the consumer that uses this app, but also what are the additional functionalities we may need to have based on this. And so one of the things I got hired in as like, it was like a director of global mobile business development or something like that is the title. And so there's a mobile in the title, right? But the reality is it was really an awful lot about trying to build relationships with other apps that were on mobile phones already that were very successful, like Uber or OpenTable or something like that. And so what we started to find, though, is that even though people were using the mobile devices more, they were doing way more searches for travel, right? They were not buying any more travel. And what was very interesting about that is it was because people could just be sitting around with a bunch of friends. They could say, like, how much would it cost for us to go here? And they could just do that. But it didn't mean that they had extra days off or they had more money or anything like that to take more travel. And so what we started to like think about is that actually mobile is this like first step in the travel search experience. And so how do we connect that with the actual purchasing experience that ends up happening later? Because, even though I was like hyper focused on mobile at the time, I still felt kind of uncomfortable buying $1,000 plane ticket on a mobile phone. That felt weird at the time, right? And so all I would say is that we had a lot of PMs that were hyper focused on mobile. They had mobile in their title. And what we ended up finding out is that actually this idea of the channel was not as important. And it was more about maybe the customer or the persona or the job to be done. And again, I think a lot of teams end up focusing more in that direction. And so I would just say like, this was a time when there was an emerging technology, it was starting to get mass adoption in some way. And we were hyper focused on like mobile was like a completely different thing. when the reality is that we just didn't know how to use that technology yet, like for the customer. We didn't know what heuristics would happen for the customer. Like what would be the behavior changes that would stick for that customer? And I guess what I'm saying is like, there's a huge analogy to AI in the way that we end up using generative systems, for example, in that we don't know what the heuristics are yet for non-deterministic behaviors that come out of these systems that can generate text and imagery, can do a bunch of like very interesting things. So I guess what I would just say is like, kind of like then, like not a lot of people call themselves mobile product managers anymore. I think that we see this like rush to understand the technology, and that's fine. I mean, again, I have like a AI product design patterns course that I've taught on Maven, but it's really about trying to get people to understand like what is actually the nuance here and the patterns that we need to adjust, rather than there's now forever there's going to be a completely different set of way of doing things for AI. And I think that's the same thing. Like I think we're going to call people AI PMs. We're going to look for hyper-specific AI background right now when you're hiring people into tools that use AI. But I think longer term, it really doesn't matter. Right? It's going to be, there's a high amount of uncertainty for AI stuff in general right now. But once we get through 2 or 3 generations of this, kind of like how in mobile, at first it was a bunch of like toy apps, right? Or it was a bunch of weird experiences that didn't really make sense. But now you look at something like TikTok, right? Like that is a really dialed in experience of kind of the way that stuff is supposed to work. And there's lots of other services that do something very similar because it makes sense from like a consumer heuristic usage type of standpoint. And so I would just say like, we're not in that generation of AI yet where people understand. We're still kind of like the fact that almost everything has to go through like a generic chat interface says to me that we have not figured out what are the right ways to integrate these systems yet. So I would just say like, I think longer term, it's just going to be PM, right? And that's okay, right? Like it just means that like, if you join a team that is going to be using generative systems, you just have to understand, like, you know, you'll have to learn things about maybe the system prompt and the way that you do eval and stuff like that, right? Which is something that when you're doing HTML web pages, you had to understand what does it mean to actually, like, the amount of time for a page to load. You had to understand that as like a trade-off that you had to make, right? And in this case, it's going to be, I think maybe one of the things that is interesting about the difference here is that before we would hyper-specify what we need to build, right? And so it turned into like a PRD or a requirements document. And when I was at Hotmail, working on MSN Calendar, had to do a project about meeting requests, it turned into a 500-page spec, basically, because it had to like map between a bunch of these different things, like an ICAL RFC standard, etc. I think we should be getting out of that type of mode. And when I was at Google, I helped out with the People Plus AI guidebook, which is all about kind of like AI patterns. And one of the things that came out of that work, again, it wasn't just me, I just helped to refine some of this stuff, was basically design policies, which is trying to get into the realm of what are the behaviors we want of this system rather than what are the requirements for the system. And that's because non-deterministic systems, it's harder to specify exactly what they need to do. So this is an example of where, yes, there's probably a difference in the way that we say, these are kind of the ranges of acceptable behavior. And these are the behaviors we definitely don't want, right? Here's the behaviors we definitely do want. And then here's the spectrum of gray area that we're probably okay with right now. And that is a very different way to write a specification than the way we used to, where it would be like a very like, 5.3.4.1 is this behavior and this input, this output type of thing. And so I think those are the things that we're going to start to see, is that we change the way that we end up, say, writing documentation to have a conversation with an engineer, right? I mean, that even happened with Portal, where we were trying to do face and voice biometric recognition, and that was to then personalize the device automatically for you. But rather than me specifying like the pixel sizes of the faces in the video camera, or like the number of lumens in the room to understand like brightness or whatever, those were the wrong things for me to specify. The engineer would figure that stuff out. What we want to understand is like, what is acceptable failure behavior? Like when you live in a house with other people that you're related to, you're more likely to look like each other. And that means that facial recognition is actually much harder in that case. And so like that particular example is very interesting, is like, when would it be okay to misidentify someone either negatively or positively? Like if we have to require that you walk up to the device a little bit more, is that okay? Versus we misidentify your brother or something like that as you. And so that's a trade-off. That's a behavioral trade-off that we as product people should be talking about. We should not be specifying all the hyper particular stuff about like pixels and stuff like that. So that's an example of where I kind of started to see that coming out of AI products and AI product management.
No, it's very interesting. A couple of weeks ago, we had an episode with Mart. and it was a great episode. And he talked about the AI being the new user interface. And for, again, the same as that episode, when he started talking about it, it started to a little bit marinate in my mind. I was like, after I was like thinking like, he's actually right. He has a very good point, right? This is something that maybe is going to change the way users are interacting with the device or any software, right? So like how it used to be that if you wanted to interact with a computer, you had to write a prompt in the past, right? Yeah. Then the mouse was created, and then it was like pointer. You could drag and drop like GUI, right? And now maybe this is the next step. And a lot of softwares are also changing their way that they kind of, I would say, interact with the user. For example, in Figma, Figma Jam, you can now write that I want X, Y, Z, and then it will create the whole thing for you, right? Maybe I don't need to drag and drop. On the platform called Upwork, where there are freelancers there, now they have like a prompt section. You don't need to go through and say, what type of position do you want? How much is the fee and everything? You would just tell the AI model, and it will create that job for you in like 5 seconds.
Sure. Well, I guess maybe my disagreement about this point that's important is that we only have certain ways that we can interact with the world. And human beings are very spatial, right? Like there's a lot of research that's going into the way that we even map our brains, right? Are incredibly spatially aware. And so what I would say is that we will not, if we talk about like Figma as a good example, we're still using a web interface, right? And that web interface still requires some type of like pointing system, some type of visual display system, maybe the idea of like text and prompts, and then the idea of being able to understand natural human language. That's something that we wanted to have for a long time, but the technology was never there, right? And so I would just argue that I guess there's not really anything new. We still have to deal with like, the idea of like apps and the way that apps are built. There's affordances that are there for thumbs and fingers. We still have to deal with like, I'm on a laptop right now for how I do touchpad and keyboard for kind of like writing. And I still need a display to be able to understand and see things. And so I guess what I'm saying is like, I think that doesn't change, right? Those interfaces, affordances still don't change. Like the fact that on like one of the things that was really interesting about mobile that started to come up, right, was that you had to make touch points at least 40 by 40 pixels wide in the older version, because anything smaller was like hard for a fingertip to actually use. And so I think we still have the limitations of humans interacting with machines. And I would say that if you go to like a UX pattern website where it just talks about like web patterns that are acceptable, like, the wizard or the idea of a form or something like that, those things still apply, right? Like we're still using those. What I think we're at a very early stage about, right, is it's very easy for us to just say, because it can, it can start to predict what the text actually is trying to get at, right, and can ask questions maybe back. It's going to start getting into this realm that we want actually more specialized experiences, though, that are from that. And so I don't think that long term it's just going to be empty text box and then something comes up that you want and you're just going to do that like through a conversation. If you look at the way that OpenAI just released like canvases, right? Canvases are a really important and interesting evolution of this, because what it identifies is that, and they're coming from the fact that they had a very successful, I was at Google when ChatGPT came out, and that was like oh shit moment, if you don't mind me saying it that way, for Google. But they were coming from the idea of like pure chat because they didn't know what to do with it, right? It was an experiment, basically. And so now they're kind of backing into writing canvases, coding canvases, things like that. Whereas like people like GitHub with Copilot came from the idea of IDEs and coding experiences, and now adding in chat as a side thing, and then becoming more and more integrated or with the actual like IDE. Same thing with like Google Docs or Word, right? They have the document editing thing, and now they're adding different types of generative systems into it. And so what I'm just saying is like both of those directions are pointing to the fact that there are key ways for us to understand and visualize and interact with systems that are not just chat, because we're trying to make them more immersive over time. And I'm working on this like weird side project about kind of decision assistance and confidence. And so I co-founded this thing called the Uncertainty Project with some people that are .work, which I'm also an advisor for, which is a group about kind of like decision tracking and stuff like that. I ran 2 different workshops about what I would call decision landscapes. And what I'm trying to understand is what is the future, or what is the way that we should start to understand, not only as we're making a decision, how do we collect the information in a way that is understandable? how do we make a choice or a decision, or one person does? And then how do we communicate those decisions to other people in the future? And we came up with a lot of really interesting ideas. And what the kind of the main thing that was really inspiring for me is, I don't know if you're familiar with the terminology memory palace. Memory palace is basically, it's a way that, because we're so spatial, for the people that are like world-class memorizers, so people that can look at a deck of cards in that order, and it can be shuffled, they look at the order, they can memorize the order of that deck, basically. They do it by doing what's referred to as memory palaces, where they take some type of place that they're very familiar with, like their childhood home, and then they imagine each card at a different place as they walk through their home, essentially. And so this is very interesting, because what would that mean to have a memory palace for the way this decision was made at some point? And I think that type of idea, I guess this is like a long way of saying that there's still going to be the fact that we need visual interfaces to be able to understand some type of specialized abstraction that we can then work with. That's how mathematics works, right? Like mathematics is about a bunch of different like abstractions that are put together in some type of text-like thing for me to then imagine what that abstraction actually means in this particular case. And so I guess coming back to your main question, which again, we've got a lot of different places between now and then. I don't think that AI is an interface. I think that interfaces are interfaces, which we have today. What is actually valuable from the standpoint of a human being understanding and interacting with information in some way, that will continue to evolve. But I don't think it changes massively because of AI. I think AI is yet another functionality or capability that gets added there. Voice assistants are a great example of where, for a long time, it was very hard to do good voice assistants, right? Like the clapper is probably the first thing where you like clap twice to turn things on or off. It used a very simplistic way to do that. Now we can ask something in almost pure human language and get it to do something, right? That's an amazing thing, but that's because of a technological capability. It doesn't mean that we didn't want to use like sound in our voice not to control things, right? Like we used telephones that way. It just happened to be that like originally you would pick up the telephone, you would get connected to an operator, you would tell the operator what you wanted, the operator would patch you in, and then you would talk to someone. In this case, we could just dial, like, and actually the real affordance here is that I just press my favorites button for the person that I want to talk to usually, right? Rather than actually doing something else, even though I can ask Siri to call someone, right? So anyways, I just want to, I guess I want to just like get back to like, what are we really trying to do here? And it's usually we're trying to build interactive experiences so people can get something done. It requires them to understand information. It requires them to interact with information. And from that case, I don't think AI is like the new interface. I think it's a new capability that supports those things. And when we say AI, there's like, it's a whole suitcase term as well, right? Like AI, machine learning has been used in like, you know, detecting fraud for like decades at this point, right? Generative systems, brand new, very interesting. And there's different affordances for that technology. There's different nuance and capabilities and also like hazards inside that technology. But understanding that, we still are using phones, we're still using laptops, we're still using voice assistants. So that's maybe my point.
Yeah, absolutely. Maybe instead of version 2, it's like 1.1.
Fair. Well, yeah. And to be fair, right? Like, when we talk about things like there's a really interesting term, skeuomorphism. And skeuomorphism is this concept of like, we end up actually like using old things that we understood. So like the idea of a disk icon representing save, even though there's no disks involved anymore. Things evolve because that was like a skeuomorphism. That's a bridge from me understanding how disks worked to understanding that it's actually being saved on the cloud. But now we don't even do that, right? Now the actual default experience is that it's just auto-saving all the time to the cloud where your content is actually saved in some way. And so I want to be pretty clear about that, right? Like I think what's important here is that we will continue to evolve things. I think AI will force some evolution. I don't think it's like that every button will have like the little twinkly icon to mean that there's AI behind it. I think that will go away eventually because it's not as helpful, right? But the idea of like Figma helping you create a workshop like board, that's very interesting. I've found it to not be as good right now, and so maybe there's like a capability issue here. But I also just sometimes know that I just want like this type of board. Like I'm going to be working with some people to do some like assumption mapping, and it's just like a very particular way of doing something. And so I just want an assumption mapping board. When I asked Figma to do that, it didn't really understand. It gave me like a mind map of assumption mapping. And so maybe it's just a capability thing, but like in that case, I still kind of have like an affordance that I'm trying to go for that I just wanted.
What are the biggest challenges in operationalizing AI solution at scales, and how does GitHub address them in tools like Copilot?
Yeah, I work pretty closely with the Copilot team as like an embedded product ops person. And so I see kind of like across all their work. I'm also the lead responsible AI champ for GitHub. So I do a lot of the work around how do we kind of like make sure that the stuff is safe and compliant as we're building it too. I would say that the biggest issue right now is actually maybe more just specific to the situation that that GitHub and Copilot is in, which is that it's a very, very volatile kind of technology space. And there's a lot of competitors that are starting to enter the marketplace. And what that means is because Copilot is kind of the incumbent, like we are there potentially to like lose our marketplace, right? Our placement within the market. And so we have to be aware of kind of competitors from the standpoint of there's lots of people trying lots of different things, and some of them will work and some of them will not. And so being aware of that type of stuff, there's a hazard that we can become too reactive, right? But there's also like an issue that we need to make sure that we're not like losing sight of what the innovation that is taking place, because we're part of a large company, right? We're part of Microsoft. And so there's a lot of like amazing capability in the size of teams that we can apply to these problems. But there's also the issue that for any very large organization, you end up kind of dampening the ability to do new things as well. And that's just like true about every major company, unfortunately. I think from the operational standpoint, for me, is one, trying to make it so that PMs can really do their best work from the standpoint of, getting out of the way. Like whenever you have a large company, there's lots of processes that people want to have because they help reduce risk, right? And so this is where like project management, TPM, program management comes in, is they're there, in my opinion, to like de-risk the ability of delivery. The problem is that in a large company, once you start to de-risk all of this stuff, it means that you also start to lose the capability for innovation. And so I guess what I'm constantly trying to find is what is the right balance between adhering to policies inside of Microsoft, making sure we're compliant, that Microsoft and GitHub don't get sued or something like that, right? But also allowing for that ability for us to do better product thinking. Yeah. So maybe one example of that is that it can be fairly ad hoc in the way that we end up deciding what to work on in some case. Like we want to make sure that AI is kind of diffused through the entire product, but no one actually knows what is the end state of that yet, right? No one does. And that's because we're going to go through, like I said, 2 or 3 more generations of like, how does AI assist coding in some way? How do we know that that's beneficial? And so there's lots of work that we're doing just to even understand that, right? And I don't think anybody knows. I do think that like there's a lot of really exciting experiments that are happening in the marketplace. And what we're seeing is that there is something there. There definitely is, right? Like there's a huge interest by everybody about this. But how do we try to do a better job of quantifying it? How do we do a better job of understanding the right experience? Those are things that like trying to allow for more experimentation, for example, like that's really important. How do we allow people to do previews in the marketplace more easily so that we can get feedback on the way that things work? But I again, because of this is so contextual to the team, I feel like a lot of my job is just trying to make it so that they have a little bit more time to do product thinking. And that is very hard in, again, large company context plus highly volatile market or environment that we're existing within, a fear of competitors, right? Like that creates a mindset that tends to be more, unfortunately, like reductive. Like what do we need? Like what do we need to ship now to be in competition with this other group? And I think like, how do we do a better job of like strategic thinking? The way I try to support that is by asking more questions and trying to be a sounding board for PMs if I can. And then, like I said, like, product operations is usually seen as like the process owner type of stuff. I think about things rather than from a process first point of view. I think of it as like a person point of view. So an example is I do like a listening tour of all the PMs I work with every 6 months, basically. And what I'm not interested in is like, what things should I fix specifically? But it's more about like, what is the experience here for you as a PM? And how do you understand what success is here or not? How do you understand failure here as a PM? And the real issue is that sometimes we have strong culture in some places. Like I would say GitHub is really strong in just like getting like stuff shipped, right? Like we're very, very fast in that type of thing for a large company, I would argue. But what we don't always know is like, how do we connect this to kind of like a larger strategy? And sometimes the strategy is just to learn, right? Like it could be that, like, especially in very nascent or early technology adoption cycles, it's just like learning how to use this technology or how it would help someone. So anyways, like I use those types of listening tours to start to like understand where are there frictions that I can help actually remove process in some ways or alter it or standardize it, right? Like, because sometimes when you have like a lot of different teams, that's another thing that's really interesting is that GitHub was very kind of, everybody would operate kind of in their team the way they wanted to because it allowed them to be very fast. And so the coordination cost was much lower. Now we're asking them to coordinate more, which includes more process cost. But how do we know which things should still be grassroots? That's a really interesting question. And I guess from my point of view, I end up starting to think about it. There's this framework called Cynefin, which comes from Dave Snowden, and it's Cynefin, and it's a Welsh word. That's why I think for the first year I'd been reading about it, I didn't know how to pronounce it. But anyways, it's pronounced Cynefin. But it talks about these like different domains of problems. And there's basically 4 major domains: clear, complicated, complex, chaotic. And then there's like a little area which is like disordered, where we just don't know what domain we're in. And I guess I've started to look at it as like a lens for how I try to decide. Like the lens itself is actually very important because you could look at things in any one of those domains, essentially. When we think about like people and groups of people, the usual default lens is complex. And the reason why is because those people interact with each other. They all have independent goals. You sometimes like to see if something will work, you'll have to try it out first and then like understand. That's called like probe, sense, respond is kind of that terminology inside there. But when we talk about process, what we're really trying to do is move it into the complicated space because we want to be able to like standardize things. We're actually changing our lens from this is a group of dynamic people to this is a set of machinations that we can do best practice around. And so there's this like liminality between those two different domains where at first I usually approach it, this is a complex system, understand that system, and then see what things we need to mechanize. But there's also the opposite, which is that we've mechanized something, but it's not working for us anymore. And we need to now go back to the complex domain to be able to kind of like understand what is actually going on here so we can then maybe mechanize it again or decide not to, right? And so I'd say that's like a thing that I'm constantly trying to do is trying to understand when do we need a better process here? When do we need to like remove the process? And when do we need to maybe alter or change the process or modify it over time?
What excites you the most about the future of AI in product management? And what are the trends or concepts that you think PMs should pay close attention to?
I mean, I think the idea of kind of a private review of things, like I've always wondered whether product managers need to have some type of like I've done short fiction writing and I'm like writing a role-playing game module right now, which is a completely different way to write, like if you're creating an environment in a game than if you're writing a short story, because you can decide what happens in the short story. In this case, there's human players that are going to play this role-playing game eventually. And so there's a bunch of weird stuff. But what's always been super valuable for me is having a great editor, because that great editor pushes on the thinking that we have. Inside of the product management product, sometimes those editors are actually like your engineers, because they're going to be trying to ask and get clarification. They're trying to poke holes in things. I would say that like if you're not using these types of things like ChatGPT today to actually be editors of your work will not be as good, in my opinion. Now, I think that when you have very open-minded teams, like there's a whole kind of movement called 1 page 1 hour, which I really liked, which was it was basically like you would only write up to 1 page of content and it would only take you 1 hour, and then you would share it the moment that you needed to think about something, rather than going off and writing the 30-page PRD that is like perfectly tuned. I think there's still something very valuable about having editors within that 1 hour to like double check your thinking. And so that's where I think like product managers should be using this technology the most, is like, what did I miss? Or what are other ideas? Or if you were an engineer, what wouldn't you understand here? Right? But I don't think you should be doing it so much that you're like creating something that is perfectly polished. You want to be able to have better discussions. And I would say that's maybe my whole thing is not just about like helping people manage and deal with the uncertainty of product management. That's one kind of mission I have. And I think that, and maybe this is like maybe unfair, but I think most of the bad things that happen in the world are because people are certain about something. And I think you could think that way for about everything. But I think this idea of like, how do we get people to allow for that uncertainty inside their team? And how do we have better discussions about that uncertainty between technical and non-technical people is kind of everything that I do when it comes to like trying to do, like using a technique like empathy mapping for the machine, which is about personifying a system enough to be able to decide like how should it act, right? that allows non-technical people to say what they expect from technical people, right? Or like analogous innovation mapping is another one where using analogy is actually incredibly powerful, because if we can find all the analogies to this problem, then the technical people will say, they're like, oh, well, actually, this other thing that you brought up as an analogy was solved with this type of technology, so maybe we can use it here, right? So I think that's like where product managers need to use these tools to help refine their thinking, to troubleshoot their thinking, to test their thinking, to find adversarialness to their thinking. But it also still is about like now humans and the way that we interact with each other. And so I think that's very exciting, is like being able to get a double check before you share something, but not so much that it's like so polished that that engineer cannot actually engage with the topic in some way. And so I think that's one thing that like is going to be really interesting. I don't think though that like you're just going to press a button and your PRD will be written for you. But gaining confidence in what you're thinking is the right idea, I think, is absolutely something you can do with this tool, and you can do it privately. And that's the issue, is that we're still dealing with like power structures, or what is the perception of you as a PM, like that whole old kind of trope that like product managers need to appear very confident all the time, right? And that's true. We should. It helps the team kind of manage the things, but we know that there's all this uncertainty that is not solved right now, right? And we're okay with that. Engineering, though, they have to like ship a line of code that gets run somewhere. And so that's not uncertainty, that's certainty. And so we need to find a bridge between these two different things, I think. So that still is important from like a product manager standpoint. But I think using these tools to help you kind of double check. And I think like, one of the things that I think people lose trust in product managers the most is usually if they ship some type of document where there's just like spelling mistakes, or like, mistakes, like too much terminology, like there's not consistent terminology, there's not a common thread, sentences are just weird or not understandable. And like we should be using not only spell check and grammar checkers, right? We should do that still. But there's now like a new one, which is like, does this make sense cohesively, right? And I think that's the thing that the product manager should be. And I use it a lot for my stuff. I think there's some interesting things about like, how do we start to like, I guess the right term for it would be like, how do we play out things a little bit more? So not so much like, one thing I kind of think is interesting is asking it to take your agenda for your meeting, for example, or like workshop, and just see not only where there are probably problems and misunderstandings, but I want you to now pretend to play out this meeting and see what happens. And so that type of like theoretical trying out of things, I think, is another place that this stuff will at least give you a more open mind about what could possibly happen. Like wargaming a situation, I think is one of those things. And this is maybe where like different agents could play the role of an engineer that you're going to be interacting with to understand what might the problems be. Yeah, those are kind of some places I think are interesting.
Awesome. We are slowly getting close to the end of the episode. Is there something you would like to share with the listeners to check out or read about?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the main thing I would like point people to, I mean, I have like this book list on Amazon, which is kind of like non-PM books for PMs is what I would argue. One of the books on there that I always recommend to people is like Why Greatness Cannot Be Planned, which is a kind of a book about like machine learning, but it's really about this idea that to actually do amazing, great things, we did not get there by knowing what that amazing, great thing was at the beginning. It was kind of meandering. It was like the author, Ken, would talk about this as like, you're trying to get from one side of a lake to another, but it's foggy and there's rocks that you have to step on. And so you don't know where things are going to go. This is maybe where I have a disagreement with like Bijali and his concept around like the idea maze, is that at the beginning of the idea maze, it's like you can't see the maze. You don't know where to go at that point. And so I think that's an amazing book. That's an example of those. I also helped co-found this kind of community. There's a newsletter and there's a bunch of like tools for decision making called the Uncertainty Project. And I definitely recommend people go check that out, just because I think I've written a bunch of posts and articles about techniques I've used in decision making and done a lot of talks about that. But yeah, other than that, I mean, I think like, I always like to connect with people on LinkedIn. So if you want to chat about any of this stuff, I would love to hear from you. And I think the thing I always want to hear from people is like, did you try something like this out and how did it work out in your context? Because that to me is very interesting, right? None of these things work perfectly all the time. And there's no silver bullet for like how to do work within a product team. And so I always just like to understand a little bit more about maybe what have you found to work, and maybe I can learn from that too.
Absolutely. We will put all the links in the description,
yeah, cool.
So you can check that out. And also reach out to Chris. He's an awesome guy on LinkedIn.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for joining this episode.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for all the great questions. I'm really looking forward to connecting with your audience, and we just love to hear how they do product management. So thank you.
Awesome. Thank you.
Wow, you made it till the end. I'm very proud of you. Comment down below which part of the podcast did you like the most and who should I interview next. Also, on the screen, you will see a lot of our other great episodes that you should definitely check out.